Welcome to today's Explainer, everyone. Today, we're unpacking what I consider to be a truly monumental shift in how we measure the Indian economy. We're talking about India's landmark statistical transition away from the old, long-standing Wholesale Price Index, or WPI, and moving toward a much more modern Producer Price Index framework, which we'll be calling PPI. Look, if you want to understand how economists actually measure inflation, how we calculate real GDP, or how we gauge the true health of domestic manufacturing, you absolutely have to understand this transition. It is a massive deal.
So, here's our roadmap for today's session. We're going to start by getting a solid grasp on what producer prices actually are. Then, we'll look at the shift from WPI, break down the architecture of India's newly announced PPI scheme, explore the macroeconomic benefits of this transition, and finally, wrap up by looking at the very real implementation challenges lying ahead.
Let's just dive right in with Part 1, Understanding the Foundations of Producer Prices.
Before we can really appreciate why this policy reform is so important, we have to understand the exact economic stage we're measuring here. In economics, where you measure a price is honestly just as important as the price itself. So what is a producer price index? Well, a PPI is a measure of the average change over time in prices associated with domestic production. But the absolute key phrase here is captured directly at the producer level. We are looking strictly at prices right at the factory gate. That means we're recording the price before any wholesale trade margins get tacked on, before any retail markups, and before any transport costs are added to the final product. It's a pure, unadulterated reflection of the economics of production, completely isolated from the economics of distribution.
Now, when you hear a phrase like producer inflation, a pretty critical question should pop into your head as an analyst. Are producers actually receiving higher prices for the goods they sell, or are they just paying a lot more for the raw materials they need to make those goods in the first place? Think about it. Those are two entirely different economic forces, right? One tells you a company has strong demand and great pricing power, while the other tells you they are getting hit by a cost-push shock that's probably crushing their profit margins. A truly modern statistical system has to be able to tell those two stories apart.
And that's exactly what a modern PPI framework does. It solves this by splitting the data into two distinct directions. First, we have the output PPI. This tracks what a factory earns at basic prices. Essentially, it's the pure revenue retained by the producer for the goods or services they create. On the flip side of that ledger, we have the input PPI, which measures the prices paid by producers for their intermediate inputs at purchasers' prices. By tracking both what a factory spends to operate and what it earns from selling its goods at the exact same time, we get this incredible ability to accurately gauge profit margins and corporate pricing power in real time.
Okay, so that covers the basics. Let's move on to Part 2 and ask the obvious question: why change from WPI and why do it right now?
If measuring producer prices makes so much logical sense, why did India rely on the Wholesale Price Index for so long? And why did it become such a structural macroeconomic headache? The crucial point is the fundamental conceptual difference between these two metrics. The WPI captures prices at an intermediate commodity exchange stage. This means a WPI price is very often inflated by extra things like transport costs, distribution margins, and indirect taxes. To put that into perspective, let's say diesel prices go up. Suddenly, shipping gets more expensive and boom, the WPI rises, even if the factory itself didn't change its core selling price by a single rupee. The PPI, on the other hand, focuses purely on the production stage, explicitly separates those inputs from outputs, and most importantly for the modern era, it finally begins to include services.
And honestly, that inclusion of services is the real catalyst for this whole reform. Today, India is heavily a services-dominated economy. Yet our primary producer-level inflation metric, the WPI, was fundamentally just a goods-dominated index based on a totally obsolete 2011-2012 base year. Think about how much the world has changed since then. A base year that old is a huge problem today because it completely misses the massive explosion of the digital economy, modern software services, and the incredibly complex global value chains that have popped up over the last decade. Trying to measure a digitally integrated, services-led economy using a decade-old, goods-only wholesale index, it just meant our national statistics were no longer accurately representing what was actually happening on the ground in domestic production.
So how are we fixing this? Let's jump into Section 3 and look at the actual architecture of India's new PPI scheme. To fix these glaring structural mismatches, the Office of the Economic Advisor, which sits under the Department for Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade, has rolled out an entirely new statistical architecture. And I want to be clear, this isn't just a fresh coat of paint or a quick rebranding.
It establishes a modernized base year of 2022-2023, plus it introduces an entire family of specific indices. We're getting an output producer price index, a trial input PPI, which is initially restricted just to manufacturing, and crucially, 7 distinct service producer price indices.
Let's take a closer look at how that output PPI is actually weighted across the different sectors of the economy. Agriculture, forestry, and fishing make up 22.16%. Mining and quarrying sit at 3.42%. Meanwhile, manufacturing and electricity absolutely dominate the index, taking up 74.42%. Now, these specific weights aren't just guessed, they're derived directly from the supply tables of the national accounts. For us economists, this methodology is a massive deal because it tightly binds the index to the actual contemporary makeup of India's domestic output. We aren't just relying on random surveys of traded commodities anymore, the whole index is mathematically anchored to the true, real-world size of these underlying sectors.
And as for the services sector, the introduction of these 7 initial service PPIs marks a truly historic break from the old goods-only WPI era. For the very first time, we are officially tracking producer prices in banking, securities, insurance, pensions, railways, air transport, and telecommunications. Now, the government has been clear that this coverage is still in its experimental first phase, but even so, formalizing an index for these specific sectors is a massive conceptual leap forward when it comes to accurately measuring the modern Indian economy.
That brings us to Section 4. What are the actual macroeconomic benefits of this transition? Why does this matter?
Seriously, why go through all this trouble to overhaul the system? Well, let's look at how this helps us understand the practical inflation transmission chain. You can think of the PPI as a sort of early warning radar system for the broader economy. Imagine a sudden global shock to raw material prices. First, we'll see the input PPI rise. As those production costs swell, factories are eventually forced to react to survive, meaning they raise their factory gate prices. We then see that reflected as an output PPI rise. Finally, months later, those elevated costs trickle all the way down through the wholesale and retail distribution chains to hit the end consumer. That's when it finally shows up in the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. By tracking PPI meticulously, the central bank can actually forecast consumer inflation long before it ever hits your local market.
Furthermore, this transition resolves a really critical national accounting issue that has been driving statisticians crazy for years. Whenever you want to calculate real GDP or real gross value added, meaning you want to know the actual physical volume of goods produced rather than just the inflated amount of money made, you have to divide nominal output by a price deflator. You do this to mathematically strip out the inflation. But because the old WPI included all those messy trade margins and indirect taxes we talked about, it was a deeply flawed deflator. By switching to an accurate output PPI deflator, which measures pure, untainted factory gate prices, we get a vastly clearer, much more precise picture of the actual physical volume growth in the economy.
And this new system also unlocks some incredibly powerful microeconomic insights. Because we can simultaneously track the input PPI and the output PPI side by side, we get to evaluate corporate health on a macro scale. Think about it. If input costs for a specific sector shoot up by 10%, but their output prices only rise by 5%, we know instantly that those firms are absorbing the extra cost themselves and their profit margins are actively getting squeezed. It serves as this fantastic real-time gauge of industrial pricing power.
There are a ton of broader systemic advantages to point out too. This transition finally brings India's statistical architecture in line with IMF standards and the UN system of national accounts. That means seamless global comparability. It also hands our policymakers highly granular, sector-specific data so they can design much better industrial policies, like the production-linked incentive or PLI schemes, because they'll finally understand the exact cost structures of these industries. And for private businesses, it gives them highly specific benchmark indices that they can use for accurate cost benchmarking and writing fair, reliable contract escalation clauses.
But it's not all perfectly smooth sailing. Let's move to our final section, the real-world implementation challenges and frictions. While the economic theory behind PPI is incredibly sound, what are the actual real-world data frictions preventing an immediate flawless rollout? Well, the Indian economy presents some very unique data collection hurdles. For one, we have a vast informal sector and millions of micro, small, and medium enterprises. A lot of these businesses simply do not maintain standardized digital price records that can easily be fed into a national database. On top of that, there's a huge challenge in capturing actual transaction prices. For example, a producer might have a quoted list price of 1,000 rupees for a product.
But after hidden discounts, special rebates, and long-term bulk contracts, the actual price the buyer pays is much, much lower. If our new index only captures those list prices, it's going to completely misstate the actual level of inflation. And this brings us to a really fascinating methodological difficulty. Imagine the price of a massive manufacturing machine goes up by 10%, but the new model of the machine is 20% faster and significantly more energy efficient. How much of that 10% price increase is pure inflation, and how much is just you paying a premium for fundamentally better quality? This is a classic economic problem known as quality adjustment, and it is notoriously difficult to calculate accurately. Similarly, how in the world do you measure the exact standard price of a bundled telecom package that changes its terms every single month, or a highly customized financial service? Pricing heterogeneous, constantly evolving services is incredibly complex.
We also have to acknowledge the immediate structural limitations of the current rollout. Look, while the 7 new service indices are a fantastic starting point, they still exclude massive, absolutely vital sectors of India's economy. We're talking about IT, software, healthcare, and road transport. Furthermore, remember that the input PPI is currently just an experimental index, and right now it's restricted entirely to the manufacturing sector. So having a truly economy-wide measure of all production costs across every single sector is still years away from reaching full maturity.
And precisely because of these current limitations, the government couldn't simply abolish the old WPI overnight. For roughly the next 5 years, the WPI and the new PPI will actually be published in parallel. Why? Well, because the WPI is deeply, legally embedded in legacy price escalation clauses across massive, long-term government procurement and infrastructure contracts. If you just erase WPI today, it would immediately trigger severe legal disputes and cause massive windfall gains or losses across the corporate sector as these massive contracts essentially fail to compute. So a steady, parallel transition period is an absolute legal and economic necessity. I want to leave you with a really crucial proposition drawn directly from the source material for today's explainer. Adoption of the name PPI alone does not guarantee statistical quality. That is such a vital reminder for all of us studying these macroeconomic metrics. Moving to an internationally accepted naming convention is a great step, sure, but the true test of this reform lies entirely in its rigorous, transparent implementation. It relies on the accurate capture of actual transaction prices, and it absolutely requires continuous, independent technical scrutiny over time. And that leaves us with a final, somewhat provocative thought to consider. This transition represents a major structural movement. We're going from merely measuring prices in the trading chain to actually measuring prices deep within the production system itself. But the ultimate question remains, will India successfully evolve this initial, limited framework into a comprehensive, fully economy-wide map of price formation? I highly challenge you to monitor this statistical evolution closely over the coming years, because it is going to fundamentally shape how we measure and ultimately how we understand Indian economic growth. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll see you next time.